Thank you so much, Ronnie. And welcome everyone to day 2 of the Patent Literacy Symposium. I'm excited to be here and sharing with you one of my favorite strategies for connecting phonemic awareness to phonics, which is the use of phoneme-grapheme mapping. So today we're going to be talking about the difference between phonemes and graphemes, between phonemic awareness and phonics, and then we're going to spend some time practicing phoneme-grapheme mapping strategies with some selected words. Now, obviously, within 75 minutes, I can't go through every type of phonics pattern or grapheme pattern that there is. However, I'm trying to give you at least a smattering of examples. So if you would like to work alongside me today and participate, I encourage you to locate a few materials. If you have access to something to use for tokens, perhaps pennies, bingo chips, even some paper clips would honestly work at this moment. That would be great. But at the very least, if you have a piece of paper and a pen or pencil available, or a whiteboard and a whiteboard marker that you can draw 5 to 6 boxes on for our mapping exercises, that would be great. So for reading, one of our goals for reading is for students to learn to be able to read words automatically without having to put a lot of thought into it. And Dr. Linnea Airy in 2022 said the road to automatic reading is not short and it's not reached directly by having novice beginners practice reading words on flashcards. And if you've been around as long as I have, 20 plus years in education, you may think back and remember that that was the way that we were often taught to teach our sight words, was through the use of flashcard practice. The science of reading, however, is been teaching us that this is not the best way for students to learn automatic word reading. So we're going to start with some common misconceptions and go over a little bit of vocabulary that we're going to need for this afternoon. So this question comes up a lot. Phonics and phonemic awareness, aren't they the same thing? Actually, they're not. But to further understand the difference between phonics and phonemic awareness, let's talk a little bit about phonemes and graphemes. So a phoneme refers to an individual unit of sound in our spoken language, such as or sh. A grapheme, on the other hand, refers to a written symbol. In English, this would be our letters, or sequence of symbols. So it can be more than one letter, such as the letters P, SH, or the letters IGH, that are used to represent a single sound or a single phoneme in our language. Now, the difference between phonemic awareness and phonics that often get confused, phonemic awareness is a sub-skill of the umbrella term phonological awareness, and phonemic awareness refers to the ability to identify and manipulate individual phonemes or sounds in spoken language. So the ability to hear the word cat and then segment it into a and reblend cat. Phonics, on the other hand, refers to the instruction of connecting those sounds or phonemes with the graphemes, those letters or symbols that the sounds are represented by. Another misconception is that the idea that students need to master phonemic awareness before they begin adding phonics. And this is not the case. There has been no research that has supported the idea of teaching these two skills separately. In fact, Structured literacy mentions that they should be integrated or taught together. And honestly, phonemic awareness and phonics naturally build upon each other. Again, research has shown that when phonemes and pronunciation of words are connected to the graphemes and the spelling of words, this causes orthographic mapping to be activated in our brain. And if you join tomorrow morning and for Dr. Pace Miles, she's going to be talking more about orthographic mapping. Over time, that orthographic mapping leads to securing those words in memory and helping them become sight words. Which leads me to the next common misperception. And that's the idea that sight words refer to dolch or fry lists. I know that was the way I was originally taught myself. So sight words are often referred to as those irregularly spelled words or the high frequency words whose phonics patterns haven't been introduced yet in kindergarten, first, or possibly even second grade. However, a sight word I want you to think about a little differently. A sight word is a word that one can recognize automatically without the need to decode. And by decoding, segmenting, and blending those sounds together. In fact, all words have the potential to become sight words with enough instruction and practice. As a matter of fact, probably for most of you looking at the screen, most of the words on the screen, if not all of them, are indeed sight words. Orthographic mapping, and again, I'm not going to go into this deeply, but orthographic mapping is the process that happens in our brains when our brain makes connections between the phonemes and the graphemes, and they become bonded with word meaning. This is what leads to greater fluency and better comprehension. So I want to take a quick moment just to review a couple of those vocabulary words that we just practiced. So the first one, an individual unit of sound in our spoken language is called what? Take a moment to think about it. Then I'm going to cue you to answer orally, even though I know we can't all hear the choral response. You can still do this on your end. So again, an individual unit of sound in our spoken language is called a phoneme. A written letter or letters, which are used to represent a single phoneme in our language, are called what? Graphemes. And any word that we can automatically read without needing to decode is called a sight word. So again, remember, our sight words can be any word that we're able to read automatically. I think it's very important, not just for us as teachers, but also for students, to understand the why behind what we're learning or what we're providing instruction for. And Linnea Airy, back in 2005, mentioned this. Grapheme phoneme connections provide a powerful mnemonic system. They provide the glue that bonds letters and written words to their pronunciation and memory, along with their meanings. And once the alphabetic mapping system is known, readers can build a vocabulary of sight words easily. This is what we're trying to do with Phoneme-Grapheme mapping, is we're trying to assist students in providing a scaffold of how to take the sounds in our language and map them or match them to the letter or letter sequences, the graphemes that represent those sounds. And this process can help us better retain that information and lead to better automaticity. So your students do need a couple of prerequisite skills and able to work with phoneme-grapheme mapping. So they need to be able to accurately recognize letters and produce letter sounds. Now, that said, students don't need to learn all of the letters or all of the letter sounds in order to start phoneme-grapheme mapping. Again, as structured literacy advises, we should be integrating these two activities together. So once your students have learned at least several consonants and perhaps one short vowel, they can start mapping words. When students have, for example, short A, M, S, and T, they can begin tapping, mapping, zapping, which is really a way to refer to blending, and graphing, which is writing the words as, at, mat, sat, sam, am. All of these words, we can start providing that very explicit instruction in how those sounds in our words map to letters. Another piece I want to really stress is that it's very important to provide explicit instruction. And hopefully you will all be staying or returning, I should say, tomorrow to listen to Dr. Anita Archer, who is absolutely the queen of explicit instruction. We need to explicitly teach the phonics skills that we're asking students to map. We can't just give students boxes and say, okay, let's map all these words. We need to provide explicit instruction so the students understand what they're mapping and why and how. So explicit instruction, just again in short, starts with the I do. As a teacher, I'm going to model, I'm going to think aloud, I'm going to explain to the students my thinking and how I think through what I'm doing, my process. A lot of we do, as Anita will likely remind us tomorrow, there's no such thing as too much practice. Right? So we want to practice with students and give them the opportunity to have multiple practice opportunities and multiple opportunities to respond verbally and in writing, along with, as the teacher, we provide corrective feedback. We may also consider having students partner with another classmate and again, do some additional practice. The students can take turns being the teacher and the student within a partner pair. And again, as the instructor, we're going to be walking around the room and helping to provide that corrective feedback. We certainly don't want to have students practicing incorrectly. Finally, we'll offer the you do. The you do is when we check for understanding. Now, that also involves corrective feedback. And we want to, again, make sure that each individual student is grasping the concept. Now, that may look initially during the lesson like a quick check for understanding for just a couple of students, perhaps 2 students that we know are weaker with reading skills and 1 stronger student. Or it may be in written form, maybe an exit ticket or a ticket out the door, a quick write, something to give us a little bit of feedback on what if the students are grasping the concept. Once again, if you want some more information and unfortunately or miss Dr. Anita Archer's presentation tomorrow, you can find her at explicitinstruction.org. Andrea, is there a question? Oh, Andrea, you need to unmute.
Thank you. Do you have suggestions for how to map sounds and letters to words for students who are ELs and don't necessarily know those words yet? How do you connect the words they come up with to something meaningful so that it isn't just a exercise in kind of a nonsense word fluency?
Right. And this isn't something that um, that I would encourage you to do a lot of nonsense words. We shouldn't be practicing nonsense words as much as we use nonsense words for assessment. So as far as working with the EL students, you may need to do some interweaving of some vocabulary instruction along with the words that you're teaching. Um, Probably the easiest way to do that, particularly with young or beginning EL students, is using some pictures along with the words that you're teaching. So, and you'll see that example actually coming up not too long here, where I start with a picture in order to help the students and then give the word. So great question. This is something that can be helpful for EL students. I also would really encourage you to make sure that the students can hear and produce the sound. Oftentimes sounds in other languages are not do not match. We have sounds in our language that aren't in other languages and vice versa. So really making sure again that those students understand first the sounds and the letters that are, represent those sounds, as well as if you need to do a little bit of vocabulary work along the way with our ELs friends. So great question. Thank you for asking. All right, so let's move into the next piece. Again, once we've explicitly taught the phonics skill, then we're going to explicitly teach and practice something that we often refer to as tap it, map it, graph it. Now, there are some other names that you can use for this. This is just one example. So when I'm talking about tapping out the sounds, if I were talking about the word hat, I could talk about tapping at hat. I may also map the words hat, right? And we'll talk about doing this as well. Sorry, I have to remember which way it goes. So I may do a hat, right? I've mapped them, removed them into boxes. Some of you may know this process as Elkonin boxes. Right? And then the last piece that we're going to do with this is we're going to graph it, or like I said, you're welcome to call write it if that's easier for your students. And I am going to write the letter or letters that represent each of these sounds right underneath. So H, A, T. Now I've graphed it, or I'm going to write it. So this is the process we're going to use. Of course, that's with a simple example, but this is the process we're going to use to help our students. Quick little review. Again, I want you to think about this and even say it aloud. We know with vocabulary, good vocabulary instructions, it's important for students to use the language and the words as well as listen to them. So when we're phoneme-grapheme mapping, we're going to say the word aloud, and then we are going to first tap it, next map it, and finally, we're going to graph it. So tap it, map it, graph it is the process we're going to work through. Now, I've gotten the question before, particularly for teachers of maybe older students that don't want to use manipulatives. Maybe you yourself are trying to practice this and you say, well, I don't have any manipulatives available right now. Sometimes it's a behavior issue. I was a former emotional support teacher, so I understand that as well. The tokens can be distracting. So another option for doing this is what I call dotting. So we could dot it instead of in order to map it. So if I say the word mop, I could say the sound ah, and I could put just a little dot in each box for the sounds that I hear in the word. You could even optionally X out the boxes that you don't use. So, now I could go through and I could actually graph it or write it, in the boxes. So this, again, is another option. You can use the tokens. I will say for some students, manipulating the tokens is a helpful scaffold. For other students, the dotting of the boxes works just as well. Another interesting fact I just wanted to share with you is that if you aren't aware, our language is an alphabetic language. We have 26 letters. That's pretty common knowledge. But what you may or may not know is that those 26 letters can be combined in different ways to produce 44 sounds. So we have 44 sounds in the English language. And of those sounds, there are over or about 250 different ways to spell those sounds. And that's one of the pieces that causes English to be a very deep language. Using this process, the Phoneme-Grapheme mapping, however, and we can teach students even basic letter sound combinations, this will give them access to approximately 84% of words in English print. Now, this is the basic. There are more advanced. You may think of, well, what about words with schwa or words that we borrow from another language like garage or genre, right? That's when we're getting into more complex letter sound combinations. And again, still possible to map, but it's great to think that students with just basic understanding can get up to 84% of words in English. So I want to take you through a practice lesson to show you a little bit about what this looks like. First of all, if I'm going to be teaching students about digraphs, we haven't talked about digraphs before, they're not familiar with what digraphs are, my vocabulary instruction might look a little like this. Now, I'm going to do some teacher talk. I'm going to give cue whenever I want students. I might cue think and then speak or respond. So it sounds like this. Today, we're going to be learning about a new spelling pattern called a digraph. What's the word? Digraph. A digraph is when we have two letters that work together to make one sound. Two letters, one sound. So if I have two letters that are working together to make one sound, what do we call that? We call it a digraph. SH is a digraph because these two letters work together to make one sound. So if we have two letters to make one sound, this is an example of a digraph. If we have a ship, the word ship, let's tap out the sounds in the word ship. What sound do you hear in the beginning of that word? And we know if we hear the sound, that is an example of a digraph where we have two letters that make one sound. So we're going to spell that with an SH. And again, this is just a really quick, fast example of what I may do as part of introducing a new vocabulary word. This is another way that I sometimes will explain a digraph to students, particularly students that might struggle with the idea of how the why we say that is one sound. So I may say, here's the word ship, we're going to write them by letters. This time I'm going to write, because this is the board I have, one letter in each box. So if I put one letter in each box for the word ship, now let's try to sound out that word. The hip. Does that sound right? The hip? No. Let's tap out the sounds in the word ship, or we can map the sounds in the word ship. So there goes my token. Let's move that over. All right, we're going to do that's interesting. We already talked about the fact that ship has 4 sounds to, or 4 letters to it, but it only has 3 sounds. That's because we've learned the digraph. We need to put the SH, which are 2 letters that make 1 sound, in a single box, because each of these tokens represents 1 sound in the word ship. So ship. This is just an example of a way that we can help our students better understand how to read the word, or understand what a digraph is in a word. Again, 2 letters, 1 sound. This screen is just for your general knowledge, because we're going to be practicing doing some mapping of words coming up shortly. And if you don't have background knowledge already of digraphs or trigraphs, again, you can refer back to this particular slide in the presentation. Now, I will remind you that all of these examples need to be explicitly taught and practiced. Again, for time reasons is why we're doing it more quickly. So before we get into our first practice session, let's review the 3 steps that we're going to do after we say a word aloud. We're going to tap it. All right, so segment those sounds, counting the phonemes in the word. Then we're going to map it, either by sliding tokens or putting dots in boxes. And finally, we're going to graph it, which would be spelling the word by putting each grapheme that represents each phoneme in a box. So let's take a look at the word check. If I wanted to practice mapping the word check, the first thing I'm going to do is say the word. So check. Can you tap the sounds in check? How many sounds did you end up with? 3 sounds. So we can either count off 3 boxes and put dots in them, or again, we can actually map those by moving the tokens. The last step would be to graph it. And as you'll notice, that both the CH and the CK are shown in one box. That's because these are digraphs, 2 letters that work together to make 1 sound. While you're doing this and showing this, again, having the students practice it along with you is very important. I have a quick slide on consonant blends and digraph blends. Again, this might be something that you aren't currently familiar with. A blend can also be referred to as a consonant cluster. Andrew, do we have a question?
We do. Before you delve into that,
Sure.
Dan was wondering about, when is it appropriate to stop the tapping and mapping and move directly from hearing the word to graphing it? Are there indicators that the intermediate steps of tapping and graphing are no longer necessary?
That's, again, a great question. And I would say, and let me just pop back to this particular screen, as your students become more secure with the tapping, with mapping, and they are showing you that maybe by jumping right in, I may start off with tapping. And I will say that tapping is also often something that connects to at a particular instructional program. A lot of programs use that as an example. And then the next step that I may move to is, instead of tapping it out first, I may say, okay, we're going to stop tapping. We're going to start with mapping it. So that may be my next scaffold, my next step. And we're going to either mark the dots or move the tokens. Then if you were using tokens, you may move from tokens to dots. I would say that once students are pretty secure in their understanding, they're demonstrating that you're not having to give a lot of corrective feedback on how they're mapping the words, then you may be able to just give them boxes. And as a matter of fact, some of the documents that I've included along with the copy of the slide presentation today, I'll show you at the end, have some different examples of ways to map words. And you can even eventually move to having students write out words by syllables rather than individual sounds. So that's another example. As far as explicitly, how do I determine that? I do that by watching how the students, doing formative assessment with the students, and how well do they seem to be able to handle that? How accurate are they? And once I feel that they're pretty accurate, then they may start removing some of those scaffolds, removing tapping, removing tokens, removing dots. So kind of in that order. So hopefully that answers your question. And if not, please feel free to ask for additional clarification, and Andrew will let me know. All right. Great question. Again, jumping back into the presentation with the consonant blends. Blends are different from digraphs. In a digraph, as I demonstrated with the word ship, you can't pull the sounds apart. They only make one sound. The difference for a blend is that you can hear, or a consonant cluster, is that you can hear both sounds of the letter. So if I were saying the word blot, b, ah, b, ah, I can hear individually both the B and the L sounds. Now, when we speak it, we co-articulate or blend it together fairly quickly. And that's where the word blend came up. Blends may be 2 letters, they may be 3 letters. They could be 2 sounds, they could be 3 sounds. Again, depending on the word. There is also something called a digraph blend, where we have a digraph such as and the SH along with another letter that is co-articulated quite quickly, such as the R. So sure is an example of a digraph blend. Ronnie?
Hi, Kristen. So a question came in. What about doing this with older students?
Yeah. So in all honesty, I actually even use this with my own kids, and I used it with my own kids in upper elementary and middle school because it's a great support for spelling. When you think about it, spelling is a much more difficult skill to learn than necessarily reading. I don't know about you, but I know I can read a lot more words than I can spell. This helps even me as an adult make those connections as when I'm trying to sound out the word, because I want to spell it, thinking in the phonemes first and then trying to remember those graphemes that match the phonemes is a great strategy. And I would say even for your middle school or high school students for whom reading and in particular spelling is a struggle, this can be a great strategy. I used to have, like I said, even my own kids at home, let alone my students, map out, for example, spelling words, or if they were having trouble spelling something in their writing, perhaps mapping it out. Another great question with that. All right, so I want to show an example of how I would map a word shrimp. Now, shrimp is a word that has both a digraph and actually not just one blend, but two blends. It has a digraph blend and then a regular blend at the end. So I might, again, start off by tapping it. Right? Shrimp. So I had 5 sounds. Or maybe I'm skipping the tapping part now and we're going right to mapping it. I might dot shrimp. So I segment it softly to myself as I dot each box. And I put a dot in each box. Then I might graph it. Now, I know that there were 5 sounds because I've dotted 5 boxes. So now I'm going to map it or put the graphemes that match each of those phonemes that I heard. SH for the sh, R for the r, I for the I, and M, P. So now I've mapped it into the boxes. You could also try some other words. So for example, the word tenth looks like this, all right? We have, again, another digraph blend, this time at the end of the word. Now, there are a couple oddities in our language. I know it probably comes as no great surprise. So the letters Q, U are what we often refer to as buddy letters. Q and U always come together in the English language. Now, one way we may show Q and U and the fact that they're buddy letters is when we write QU in the boxes, I put the Q a little bit more to the right and the U a little bit more to the left of its box, and I may circle it to help remind myself and help remind the students that these two letters work as a team together, but they do make 2 sounds because they make the sound W. So it's a KW sound. Since they are 2 sounds, that's why these letters are in separate boxes, but they're not going to influence the vowel. So if that's what I'm getting into with my instruction, I may have the kids circle it. The letter X is another oddity because the letter X is the only sound in our alphabet that has 2 sounds by itself, or depending on the word. So in order to show that this has 2 sounds, but it's 1 letter, we often put the X on the line between 2 boxes in order to give that indication of 2 sounds. I want you to remember, explicit instruction is always going to include multiple opportunities for student practice and response while receiving teacher feedback. Andra?
If a student has trouble or difficulty hearing a particular sound, what suggestions do you have?
Another great question. One I would do is I always encourage you to work closely with your speech pathologists. They can be very helpful with students that have trouble hearing those phonemes and sounds. Another suggestion, again, that I had gotten from a friend who was a speech pathologist is using mirrors. So I may have, and I'm sorry I don't have one with me at the moment, but I may use a small mirror, almost something like that a woman might carry in her purse. And I hold it up and I really help the students when producing the sound. This is something, again, that would often come into play with our English language learners that someone asked before. But what shape is my mouth making? Where is my tongue located? Where am I producing the sound within my mouth and throat? So if I'm saying the sound, I'm getting the students to look where they're producing the sound, again, where their tongue is. Also, is their voice box on or off? For example, the letters and g. If you say, this is what we call an unvoiced sound, you won't feel your voice box moving. If we say, g, you'll feel the voice box moving because they look very similar for what they see in the mirror. So again, understanding some of this about how sounds are produced and helping students be able to both see and feel the difference for the sounds. Ronnie?
Hey, Kristen, another question.
Sure.
Do you need to mark the long and short vowels when writing in the boxes? I noticed the breve for the short vowels.
Right. That's a great question. And I would say it depends on what your instruction is at the time. So when you're doing, for example, single syllable words, if you're trying to really reinforce the fact that these are short sounds, you may ask the kids to put the breve in the boxes. You may also, again, that could be a scaffold that you might start backing up. And we're actually going to look shortly here at some multisyllabic words that include combinations of long and short vowels, and I'll show you some examples of what that might look like as well. Andra?
Dan appreciated the X and the QU distinction because it's often ignored. So thank you for that. What about ing and ink? You know, the king of
Very
ing,
good.
you know, Wilson teaches those as welded sounds. Others
Right.
say to separate. Any thoughts or suggestions?
Sure. And that's a great suggestion. I actually myself long taught Wilson and foundations. So very familiar with that concept. I will show you how I typically help the students with the glued or welded sounds if you are using a program such as Foundations or Wilson. This may be an example. First of all, the ng sound spelled with ng is a single sound. Again, you don't pull that apart. Ng, ng. It's said in the back of the throat. So here's how I may show it. If I were doing the word sing, for example, ng. All right. I may have the students write it out. Ng. Right. The NG is going to go in one box, but in order to connect it to the glued and welded sounds, you could also then box it, which is how they mark up the sounds in Foundations and Wilson. So I may box it in order to help the students learn. We're learning this as a chunk, but if you actually pronounce it, you're going to hear the ng. You're going to hear those two sounds. So this is how I kind of help them make that connection. Great question. And I have a feeling you're probably not the only one that had that question, or because those are both popular programs. All right. So again, getting into some explicit instruction, the question, this is the example that I wanted to talk about or link to those EL students. If I were going to be using, for example, this particular tap it, map it, graph it, and I just want to show you this example. I actually have the page in a page protector for the kids to use. Then I would give them tokens that they could put up in the boxes. I also want to give a shout out to Dr. Pam Kastner and Patton, who created this particular document, which I've been allowed to share. Ronnie?
Sorry, Kristen, tell me if this is not a good time. Okay, another question. Curious about the instruction of Q and U. We teach the Q and U wedding, but almost with instruction of U, following after the instruction of Q. Does it make a difference if Q is taught first, or should U be taught first since it always accompanies Q?
I know, again, we have a very complex language, do we not? Whenever I give instruction with Q, and again, this would be something that would be similar, you would find in Wilson or Foundations, Just Words, any of those programs. Because the Q and U always go together, we often teach that together right from the start. That's part of the reason why when I demonstrated it, I put a circle around the QU. So if I'm giving the sound of, well, I want the kids right from the start, I don't want them to think that the Q is ever going to be standing alone. So typically, I'm going to teach them when I get to the letter Q, I'm going to teach the kids right away that Q and U are always going to be buddy letters, are always going to be together. So great question. And again, I think this is something that that we've learned and we've kind of adapted some of our programs to. Another question?
Can you show us how to map words with silent E?
We're getting to that.
Gotcha.
Perfect lead in.
Perfect.
It's
Thank
coming
you.
up. All right, very good. All right, we're getting to that. Let me show you this one quickly because this one in particular would help our ELs. Like I said, I may say the word is ship. And notice that I have a picture of the ship on the screen. I could have it on a card. I could have it on, I could project it. This is a ship. Now, we say the word ship. I want the students to say the word back to me because I want to make sure they're pronouncing it correctly. This is where I may also work on their pronunciation or helping them create the correct sounds. Then we may tap it, map it, graph it. So we're going to tap out it. I may map ship it. All right, moving those tokens. Then have the kids spell it. It. Reblend. Ship. That zap it, I will say, kind of refers to, which I'll show you a little bit more later, but there are these great magnetic wands and magnetic bingo chips that when you slide across can zap that as the students blend. Right? Chain it may be something that you've done in your program. This has also been shown through research to be a great practice. So I'm going to write the word ship to the left or to the right. Then I'm going to say, now if I wanted to change ship to chip, right? Here's my picture of chip. So ship to chip. Which of these tokens am I going to change? I'm going to change the first token. One thing you may do if you're using different color tokens is you may swap out that first token for a different color. You don't have to use different colors. You can use all the same, but this is just an example. And then I'm going to spell the CH for chip. I'm going to put that right underneath chip because it's only, we're changing the word by one sound, all right? Even though we're changing letter, one sound is changing when we're chaining. Now, this is a much more complicated example, but I'm going to change chip to chimp. Right? Again, I've used a picture for my EL students. If I'm saying, chimp, chip, there's another sound in there, but it's in a different place. It doesn't come right at the beginning or the end. Where does that sound come? There's a new sound in there in between the I and the p. So I'm going to move my token out. I'm going to keep my first two tokens there because we know it starts the same. But now I'm going to move token for the and the p sound. And then I'm going to spell the sound with M and the p sound with P, and I'm going to add it to my chain on the right-hand side. So some of you have already been alluding to that, and you're excited and you can't wait to, how am I going to show these other, these letters? Because it becomes complex. Phoneme-Grapheme mapping really helps you think about words in a different way, and it's very visual, as well as being able to have a kinesthetic, the tapping, the mapping, the graphing, or writing. So take a moment and think, what are some other examples of letters? So 2 or more letters, which represent a grapheme, which represent a single sound. So we already talked about digraph, where we had 2 letters that made one sound. What are some other examples where 2 or more letters represent a single sound? Ronnie?
Folks put vowel teams, WR.
Very good. All right, so I see some of you were putting them in the chat, and that is fabulous. Yes, and those are 2. So silent letters, vowel teams, and we're going to look at some other examples too. Now, sometimes, again, some programs have these cards, which are also great. These are often referred to as sound spelling cards. If you have a program that does not have cards like this, the website that I've included on the bottom is somewhere that you can get some example cards, and I think they have at least most of the basics. But I may be introducing, for example, the long E sound, and I'm teaching it as an open syllable first, and it's spelled with the letter E. Maybe the next way of spelling the long E sound that I'm going to introduce is EE. You'll notice that I have, those are my virtual sticky notes over some of the patterns that spell EE, because I'm going to keep those covered until I've introduced those particular spelling patterns and explicitly taught them. So once I've added EA into a spelling pattern, then I will uncover that particular one. So again, I wanted to put this out here just as an example of another resource. So some examples, and these aren't all possibilities, but some of the more common ones you may come across would be examples such as bonus letters. Bonus letters, I will say, is also a Wilson term. However, you may some places call them doublets. I've also heard them called. So think about, how do you think you would graph some of these words that have more than one letter representing a single phoneme or a single sound? So I'm going to give you just a moment. You don't have to do all of them, maybe even pick 1 or 2. I want you to try mapping a couple of these words. Just a reminder, each box represents a single sound. I did throw a couple tricky ones in here. All right, so let's take a look at some of these examples. I will tell you at this moment, just in case you're feeling that you need to feverishly write down the answers to them, I did put the slides with the answers at the very end of your handouts. So that way you couldn't peek while we were practicing, but you do have those answers if you print the handouts. All right, so the first one is boss with our bonus letters. Notice that our bonus letters go in one box because we don't say the we don't make the S sound twice. It's a single sound. Our double consonants in the middle of words, we're also going to put in a single box. Now, this one can be a little trickier because it almost sounds, once we start scooping into syllables, like 2 sounds, but traditionally we're calling this one sudden We kind of, again, when we say the word, it really only comes out once. Silent letters, this was brought up, such as WR. KN is another example. And you'll notice that I slipped in a vowel team, a particularly tricky vowel team there, IGH. So IGH spells the long I sound. Therefore, it goes in a single box as well. But the K, you'll notice in night, I spell it with the K and then I slash it off. Kind of interesting little anecdote. And originally in the English language, that K and the G for GN used to be pronounced. So we had knife, knife. It was dropped as it became through time because it was a little awkward to say, but we retained the spelling. So just like I said, a little kind of fun thing you can tell your students. I also sometimes, as I'm teaching it with kids, I may say you can say it silly. So if you're having trouble remembering how to spell the word nice, say knife. That can remind you that that's how I'm going to spell it. I say it silly, but I know when I read it that I pronounce it as only as knife. Another example may be the soft C or soft G. For example, the letter C, G are softened whenever they immediately come before the letters E, I, and Y. Ronnie, is there a question?
Sure. Why not cross off the GH in IGH?
You know, that's a really good question. And not even sure if I have a really particularly good answer for that one, other than sometimes when our vowel teams are working together, particularly when we get into a vowel team like EA, that sometimes makes a long sound, sometimes makes a short sound. We traditionally don't cross out those particular letters. So we want the kids to learn that they are just all together. And that's honestly what the box is for. The box is to remind us that those letters work together as a team to make that one sound. If you made an executive decision to cross it out, that might be possible. I've just never seen it done that way. So good question, though. I'll teach you very quickly a nice little tune for remembering whenever C and G are softened. There are three sounds that soften C, E-I, E-I, Y. The same three often soften G, E-I, E-I, Y. So whenever you have a C or a G followed by E, I, or Y, they're going to make the soft sound. So they're going to make the sound for C or the J sound for G. Ronnie?
So going along with the word night, could we not cross off the K in KN then?
The K is crossed off in the KN.
Gotcha.
So yes, we do typically, there are times that traditionally we cross off a letter. You'll also see it, I know the question came about the silent E, and you'll see it in the word dance as well. Oftentimes we do cross off those absolutely silent letters. Vowel teams, we typically continue to show all the letters. Again, that's at least traditionally how we show it.
And one more,
Sure.
Going along with the word dance here, could you put an in dance together, since Foundations calls it a welded sound?
Right. Again, what I would do, because you hear both sounds, truly, you have both sounds, I would box it. Similar to what I did for the ing and sing. So I would put dance and then I would box it again. And that way you're still kind of following or making the connection to the program. But if you listen to how the word is pronounced, you can hear both of those letters. The reason why Foundations, for example, and Wilson teach these sounds as glued or welded, as they call them, or as chunks, is because whenever we have that vowel followed by the N, the M, or the the NG sound, it kind of alters the sound of the vowel a little bit. So we don't say, we don't say dance, it is an and. That N is nasalized. We say the N sound kind of up in our nasal passages. So and that slightly alters the sound of that short A. So that's why they teach them as glued or chunked sound, is because of that nasalization of the vowel. Ronnie?
Another question about the word night. Why wouldn't you cross out the GH in IGH if those are also silent letters similar to KN?
So I think that question kind of came up already. And if you missed it, that's fine. But typically, we don't cross out the vowel teams. We keep them as a whole chunk. And I think that's more for clarity of being able to see it, that those letters have to work together in order to make that sound. The silent letters, mostly that when I've seen the Phoneme-Grapheme mapping, and I will tell you kind of a little bit in advance, there is a slide with this at the end. A lot of this is based on some of the work by Catherine Grace, who's written Phonics and spelling through Phoneme-Grapheme mapping. Again, I have a link toward the end of the presentation to where you can buy this, but this book is a fabulous resource that gives you all kinds of examples of what to do in a case that maybe you're not sure when a student asks. So I will say most of how I'm walking through this is based at least or adapted from the book Phonics and Spelling through Phoneme-Grapheme Mapping. So that's where I came up with those ideas. I don't necessarily know that it would be wrong. It just might get really messy to have lots of lines in the middle of the word. All right, so the last one, actually, I did have sing, again, that ng sound at the end. And again, that is going to go in the box. If you're doing Foundations or Wilson, you can absolutely additionally box the ing in order to relate that to that glued or welded sound. Those aren't all the possibilities, but they are some. This was the next piece, and this is where we're going to get into that example of the multi-letter graphemes that represent vowels. Just a couple of examples. The first one I am going to show you is the word snake, which has our vowel consonant E or the silent E. Notice that again, typically when we're going to cross off a silent letter, it's either going to be at the very beginning or the very end of the word. In this case, that's silent E, or I shouldn't say the word, or the syllable, very end of the syllable. I cross out the E, and then I may even put an arrow back to the A to show that it makes the long sound. Now, whether or not you put the macron in there to show it's a long sound, again, that's up to you. It may also be a scaffold that you initially do and then back up as kids get better and more comfortable with this particular spelling pattern. By the same token, when we spell R-controlled vowels, notice that our R-controlled, we can't pull those sounds apart. It's not it's All right. Our vowel teams, of which we know there are quite a few, the most complex of our syllable types, notice that, again, our vowel teams are going to show up in one box. For the word coat, O sound is spelled with the grapheme OA. And for our consonant LE, which is always going to be a multisyllabic word, again, we're going to cross out that E. That E actually makes a schwa sound in the ul. In some cases, if you're talking about that, you may include a schwa symbol above it as well. And you'll notice that I've scooped the syllables in this particular word. Again, another option, another possibility when you start getting into syllable types, which leads me to just quickly to mention about the multisyllabic words, right? You can scoop. This is one way that you can do the phoneme-grapheme mapping. When we're talking about syllables, we can scoop them. You could even identify the syllable types underneath. Again, this is something that's done in a number of different programs, including Wilson and Foundation. So I may be indicating what the syllables are, as well as mapping them into the boxes. You can also see I did include the schwa above in blossom. So if that's something you're explicitly teaching. Now, I was going to have you attempt a couple of these, but for sake of time, I know we've had some awesome questions, so we're starting to run out of time. So I'm going to jump in and just kind of explain some of these examples. I will tell you, in addition to the slides, the other handout that we have, I do have another single page handout that has multiple examples of some of the things that most of what we've talked about this morning. Ronnie, question?
Sorry, just one real quick. I know we have about 7 minutes left.
Right.
At what point do we move away from boxes and just have students write the words sound by sound?
Okay. And again, that's going to be up to you as a teacher, as this is a scaffold for teaching that phoneme-grapheme relationship and how they interact, how they work together. Once students start to become more fluent with this, that's when you can move it away. I would say that I typically use this type of strategy when I'm teaching phonics, and this is a great support, particularly when I get into the encoding or the spelling related with the phonics strategy I'm teaching. We're absolutely not going to always write every word into boxes. And I will show you again another example of how to write words even just by syllables versus the individual sounds in boxes. So there are multiple different scaffolds, and you're going to use them depending on your student's need. How strongly are they showing the ability to sound them out? It may be that we're going to not use the boxes at all unless the student misspells something. Then maybe I'm going to back up and bring the boxes back out and say, okay, let's try to map this word if you're having trouble spelling it. So I do have up some examples of multisyllabic mapping as well. And again, I do have a single sheet that I've shared with you that has some of these examples that you can refer to as well. You can also map, clap, map it, write it, zap it by syllables. So for example, if I have the word fantastic, I could say the word fantastic. We could clap out the syllables of fantastic. We might map each syllable individually. All right, it's easier to map by syllable than trying to necessarily map the entire word. Hence the reason I was showing the examples with scooping those syllables as well. Write it and zap it. Okay, so then I'm going to put it back together. I have fantastic. You can also point out to kids that when we're testing them for those nonsense words, if you look at syllables, oftentimes syllables look like those nonsense words that we've kind of tested their ability on. This is an example of that document that I mentioned where as kids get stronger, now I say my kids don't need to map out each individual sound, but I still want them to kind of remember how to break a word into syllables. So now I'm going to have them, instead of doing individual sounds, we're going to map by syllables. Fantastic, fantastic. So this is another scaffold depending on what your students have. I wanted to share a couple additional materials. As I mentioned, putting something in dry erase pockets, or even page protectors is a great strategy. You saw me holding up this. I can thank Dr. Pam Kastner for this one as well. This is fabulous. This is actually a magnetic 10 frame board for math. You'll notice it works fabulously as a Phoneme-Grapheme mapping tool as well. Our Unifix cubes can be great for doing either as tokens for the mapping or putting together, separating those phonemes. I mentioned our magnetic wands and the magnetic bingo chips, which can be great for zapping or blending. Phoneme-Grapheme sound spelling cards. This is just one example that you can purchase. This one is particularly good by Mary Dahlgren, who is now working with the 95% group in order to sell her materials. She has a great set, 2 different sizes of sound spelling cards. And magnetic grapheme tiles are great. Looks similar to what they use in Wilson Foundations, and a number of other programs use these tiles as well, so kids can manipulate. This is particularly good if you have a student with dysgraphia, for the writing part is going to be challenging, but we can practice using magnetic tiles. And then these are some of the shared documents that you will find in the folder in addition to the slides, that you are welcome to use and share. Again, the Phoneme-Grapheme mapping grid examples are based a lot or adapted from the book by Dr. Catherine Grace. Why is this important? Once again, Louisa Moats says phoneme awareness instruction, when linked to systematic decoding and spelling instruction, is a key to preventing reading failure in children. So this is a fabulous strategy in order to help our kids make these connections. So I thank you very much. I know we don't have a lot of time for extra questions, but we've had some great ones the whole way through. Are there any other?